The next thing that we are going to look at is how to make our code more efficient. This manually creates an animal named a tiger, and generally we read data in from a data file, and that's one of our requirements that we will need to learn how to do. So we're going to learn how to create a data file. We want to pay attention to the format of our data here. Our data comes in as the name of an animal and the animal's original weight. So I'm going to add a resource file here. And it's going to be a new item. And my resource file is going to be a utility file. And it's just going to be a text file. We haven't looked at several of these other options here. We've mostly just used the code, the .cpp and the .h. There are some other resources that we can use here. We aren't using a database like a SQL database, so I'm not going to use the data link here. That's why I am using a utility link. So we're just going to create a data file, and I'm just going to call it my zoo, and we are going to add some data to it. So let's say we're going to have several animals. We have Zim, the tiger, and Zim weighed 200 pounds. We're going to have Slither, maybe that's going to be a snake, and he weighs 35 pounds. Maybe it's a she, I don't know. We're going to have a few more animals. I added a couple more animals. Enigma is going to be a lion weighing 210, and Komodo is going to be a Komodo dragon that weighs 180 pounds. And when that file it's now saved, you can see it over here under my resources. And I will talk to you later about where to save that file if you don't create it here locally. But then we're going to go back to our driver, and we're going to talk about how to access that data from the data file and how to read it into an array. So to get this set up, I'm going to create an array of animals, and I'm going to call it my animals. I could also call it my zoo, but that's the name of my text file, which would actually be fine. It's going to know that it's an array. So my zoo. And I happen to know that the size of this zoo is 4 because I have 4 items. Remember that when you create an array, you should use a constant. So I'm going to create a constant size of 4. And it's going to have 4 items in it. Integer data type. And then I'm going to use a loop to fill my array with and from my data file. So first of all, the process for working with a data file is that I'm going to have to open the file. I need to check for opening errors. I'm going to process the file, and that is typically done using a loop. And then I need to close the file. I'm going to go out and get the code for this and then show you how that works. Okay, I created a combination of some of the code from examples in our textbook from chapters 5 and chapters 8. So just for your information, data files are in chapter 5 and chapter 8 of our textbook. And the first thing that we need to do, I know earlier I had this checklist for what we need to do when we create a data file. And one of the first things when you open the file is you actually have to create a file stream object first. I should probably make that my first comment here, is to create a file stream object. And I've actually commented it in up above, and all of these others are also commented in. So as I talk through this, I will highlight those. In order to work with a file stream object, we have to have a special library, so we _include fstream. Fstream stands for file stream, and a file stream object can be both input and or output. Here, because I'm reading in from a file, I'm going to use an ifstream file, which is an input file stream, and I'm going to name it input file. This is an identifier that you can make up. You'll see in our textbook they might use in file. You might see some places say in data, or they just might say in. I am using input file for this example. That creates a file stream object that you can then use. We already talked through that we set up a constant of size 4, and that happens to be because I knew that I was working with 4 items in my data file. We'll talk in a little bit about what happens if you don't know that. I'm going to delete my animal that I created earlier. I'm no longer going to use that. And then I'm going to use some local variables to pull in the data. I'm pulling in a name and a weight. Remember, from my data file, I have a string followed by a number. That's very important to know what your data file is made up of, and we might run into some problems reading in data in different formats, but we will work on that when we get there. And then I'm going to create a local variable for my loop that has an index set at 0 because loops are indexed beginning at 0. In order to open my data file, it's more complicated if you're on a system and you actually have to use a path name. I am going to work with our data files assuming that our data file is in our project folder. And so that means that the resource file is located directly within our project folders. And I'll show you what that looks like before we're done here. So I open the file using input-file.open. I have to use the same name here as what I named my input file up above. Then you should always check to make sure that the file opened correctly. If it doesn't, it should throw an error. Otherwise, we can go ahead and process the file. When you process the file, it is typical to use a loop until the reading to the end of the file. This line of code right here is the same thing as what we would do is if we were to do a SYN statement and say input name, something like that. Like if I prompt the user to please input your name, and then they input your name, and then we SYN weight, for example. That's what these two prompts do here. And they pull it in from input file. And so I am basically saying please input from the file name and weight, and so we can do all of that all at once. This will return a true or a false value. In other words, if a value or values were read, then it goes ahead and does the next line of code. If this fails, in other words, if there's no more data in the file, then it exits. And so that's why we go to EOF, which stands for into file. And so if the values were read in correctly, then we're good to go. What I then did was I created my zoo. I used an index starting at 0, and I create a new animal on the fly. So I'm creating new animals as I go through, and I'm passing in the 2 parameters to my constructor. Then I have to increment my index because this is in an array. I have to go from a 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, etc. And then we close the file when we're all done, and then we're going to output the results. Now another thing that I would like to show you here is you guys should get in the habit of doing some debugging. I'm going to put in a breakpoint over here, and we're going to run this code, and the breakpoint is going to stop execution at that point in the code. And that allows you to look at some of the variables and do some debugging if you need, and you're going to start to have the need for debugging more frequently. If I take a look down here, it stopped my code here, and I can see my index is at 0. My input file, it has some information for it. It knows that I've got an animal here. I'm going to close the call stack. I don't need that right now. I'm going to close that. I'm going to close the command window. And the immediate window is sometimes nice. What I really want to do is just expand this out down here and see if I can see some more data. So this is showing me I have a zoo of 4, and I have my zoo index. If I open this up, it starts to show me that I have read in Zim at 200. And then total food is set to 0 because that happens in my constructor. And so this autos window can also be drug and moved. And so I can check and track. There's a watch window. If I want to watch a particular variable, like if I put an index in, I can watch the value of that index. Remember that you can also, if I want to here, I could pin down a value here, and I could watch the index value change. And now that I want to run through my loop again, I can go to my continue. I could also, if I click on debug, I've got some options here. I can step into, step over, or step out. If I step into, which is F11, and then step over is F10. Let's just see what happens. I'm going to do an F11. And F11, if you look here, the yellow marker moves along in the code, and it's going to the next item. And now it's going behind the scenes. When I step into, it's showing you the code that's executing behind the scenes. This is all the code that's written automatically that we don't have, or I don't want to say we don't have any control over, but that we're not, we usually don't pay any attention to it. I have no idea what it's doing right now. I'm going to go back up here to debug, and I'm going to try to step over, which will take us out, hopefully. Or I will say continue. Continue got me out of that screen. And I'm going to do F10 now, which should just step us through and look at how the value of index is changing. If I go back to my autos window, I should be able to see now that I've got 2 items in there. And if I scroll down in my zoo, I can see that I've got, that actually shows you how it breaks apart the name. Okay, I'm working now on Enigma is where it's at. So if I do an F10, that steps over the behind the scenes code, and you can debug and look at what's happening on the screen here. So I just read it in Enigma, and now Komodo shows up. And so keep that in mind when you guys are needing to debug some of your code, because that can be useful. And so when I'm all done reading in all the data, and I've gone past that breakpoint, I can just hit continue, and it should execute the rest of the code, and it shows that it read in everything successfully. I can open up my data file. I'm going to hide the autos window now. Anytime that you close those windows, if you need to get them back, you can go to view, and you can go to other windows, and the error list, excuse me, those windows will show up when you're in debug mode, so they would be on this screen here if I was back in debug mode. Because I'm out of debug right now, I don't think that they're showing up, but this is the screen to get them from. You could also go to debug, I think, and it might pull up some of those windows. So look in those 2 places. Here's the windows. There it is under debug. Debug windows, you have your watch, your autos, your locos, etc. So if you need to get those back after you've closed them, you can get them back under the debug menu. But now we saw that that successfully ran. If I look at my data here from my driver, I can look at my output window, and I can check to see that my data was read in correctly. And so I'm reading in from a data file. If I go back to my program, I'm going to take that breakpoint out. I don't need that pin anymore. I'm going to unpin it. That actually put a breakpoint in. I can unpin this over here. And then I close the file. You always have to close the file after you're done working with it. And then I automatically printed the output to the screen you saw, but this is how I did it. I used a for loop. A for loop is what we call a definite loop. And it's a definite loop because I know it's how many times it's going to execute before I run the program. And it just went through and it pulled from the zoo array, bracket I, the name. Get name is a method, so I have to have parens there. If I don't have parens there, just trying to show you some of the common errors that you might make. If I don't have parens there, it will throw an error. And if I have to find my error list, click down here or go to view error list if you need to see it. It says animal get name function missing argument list, and then it has use ampersand animal. Ampersand is a reference to create a pointer to the member. All of that means right there is that I'm supposed to be calling the method with the parens. It didn't understand it was a method because it didn't have the parens there. So if I run this again, it should execute correctly and produce my output. And so that's how to read the data in from a data file. And again, you have to create a file stream object, open the file, check for the errors, read in the data with a loop. This is the easiest way right here to read it in from the loop that I've found for you guys for right now. And then close the file. Just to see if my error message is going to work, I am going to create an error here, and I'm going to, let's say I made a typo when I read my file in, and we're going to see if that executes and throws an error with opening the data file and see what happens. Now, it says it actually read it. I don't think that should be working. So I'm going to rebuild the solution. And I'm going to try to run it again. I'm going to close all of my open windows and see if I can get an error message to throw. This is not working the way that it should. Give me a few minutes and see if I can process that. Okay, I changed the name of the file to Bob's Zoo here when it's supposed to be My Zoo, and I execute. And it still shows the output on the screen, but look at the output. It says error opening data file, and then no name and wait. Those are my default constructor values. And so I know that it didn't execute correctly, because when an animal is created, those are the defaults that it creates. Now, interestingly enough, I went back and tried My Zoo again, thinking it shouldn't work because of the capital Z in zoo here and the lowercase zoo here. I tried it again, and it worked. And so I did not think that it should work because of the uppercase, lowercase, but somewhere along the line, it's ignoring that. You do want to name them exactly the same when you're working with your data files. This did bring up another kind of a logic error that I had, though, in the respect that I have it automatically outputting whether or not the file was read correctly. So it would probably be best if I were to take this segment of code and put it inside my loop, my else statement, for the error message here. And so I would paste that there. I would also move my closing the file inside there, because as soon as I'm done opening and reading from the file, I like to close it right away. I don't know if there's any real guidelines on whether you have to do that right away or not, but I like to do that. So if we run this one more time, let's see what happens. And I need to run it with a bad error, meaning that the data file doesn't match. So let's just call it zoo. Try it again, and this time I should just get an error message thrown, error opening the data file. That wraps up the lecture on how to create and read from a data file into an array. The next lecture will talk about the fact that this is inefficient when you're using a standard size, because we sometimes don't know how much data is in our data file. And so that will be next.